So, hello, welcome back to another episode of Self-Development Tactics podcast. Today we're going through Viktor Frankl's methods to overcome fear, once again by the Einzelgänger channel. Let me just reorganize things here a bit. It should obviously be about Viktor Frankl, and in the meantime, I can also show you the video there. So there we go. Yet I do not know, or yet again I do not know when this was published, or I'm just incompetent. This could also be the case. I'm actually not quite sure, to be honest. But yeah, here you go. Viktor Frankl's method to overcome fear, paradoxical intention. I do like Viktor Frankl, and I also do really enjoy, or have really enjoyed, his book Man's Search for Meaning. It was an incredible book, incredibly insightful book as well, and probably also eye-opening and reframing things, quite many things, quite life, to be honest. But yeah, is there something more that you would need to? The song is Verve by Benjamin Martins, if this is important to you. I don't really know, but let's actually go through.
The neurotic who learns to laugh at himself, maybe on the way to self-management, perhaps to cure. Austrian psychiatrist, philosopher and author Viktor Frankl spent 4 years in different concentration camps during the Second World War.
I didn't know that it was multiple concentration camps. I thought it was just Auschwitz, but I might have been mistaken there. I think, as I'm thinking about it, he also stated in the book the different, he did state in the book the different chapters, the different stages he had to go through up until the final concentration camp, which he then very fortunately survived.
From the ashes of his horrific experiences during his imprisonment arose a school of psychotherapy called logotherapy. Logotherapy aims to help people find personal meaning in their lives, assuming that meaning is what ultimately keeps us going. Working as a psychiatrist, Frankl experienced patients who suffered from neuroses, as he described in his book Man's Search for Meaning. One of his patients was a young physician who feared sweating profusely in the company of other people. But his fear of sweating made him even more fearful, which only made him sweat more. Frankl then used a pretty unconventional method that ultimately cured his patient. Paradoxical intention. Paradoxical intention is one of the techniques found in logotherapy.
As far as I remember, it is basically thinking and making you believe that you should even, in this example, sweat more. Or when you're fearing something, I don't know, when you're just nervous in front of class or in front of the audience when you're giving a speech, then being like, well, I should actually be more nervous, like this paradox or this reversed psychology. And apparently it does help with then reducing the nervousness. Anyway, and or the sweat. But let's actually see if I'm wrong or right.
Therapists can use paradoxical intention to treat people with anxiety, fear, phobias, and even insomnia. Instead of escaping or minimizing the fear, paradoxical intention encourages us to face it head on and actually desire and wish for it as a means of conquering it. How strange this may sound. But this reverse psychology that tricks the mind out of its neuroses makes Frankl's approach interesting and worth examining. This video explores the ideas behind this technique and how it works. It's not surprising that people tend to avoid situations that evoke fear in them. We generally experience fear as deeply unpleasant, often more so than the situations that produce it. But according to Frankl, this flight from fear is the starting point of any anxiety neurosis. The very endeavor of avoiding fear, ironically, strengthens it. As soon as we fear the fear, we tumble down a rabbit hole of never-ending dread. In the book The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, author Mark Manson describes what he called the feedback loop from hell. I quote, "There's an insidious quirk to your brain that, if you let it, can drive you absolutely batty. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. You get anxious about confronting somebody in your life. That anxiety cripples you and you start wondering why you're so anxious. Now you're becoming anxious about being anxious. Oh no, doubly anxious. Now you're anxious about your anxiety, which is causing more anxiety. Quick, where's the whiskey? End quote. Viktor Frankl argued that even though someone who has a phobia tends to flight from fear, as in avoiding the situations that usually evoke fear, there's also an element of fighting against fear involved. So the sufferer tries to remove the fear forcefully. A prevalent example we often see nowadays is social anxiety. When we experience the discomfort of fear,
I do wonder, because he pointed out that we relatively prominently see it nowadays, and underlining the nowadays. Is it really the case that at this point all people are having, or more people are having social anxiety than, I don't know, some years before? Would be actually really interesting to see some data on that, because I do have a feeling that yes, this is the case. And it would also be really interesting to see if just also a bit more detailed data, not just, okay, yes, it is more than 50 years ago, but also the age groups and maybe even also year by year, if things are being, diagnosed might be a bit, because of course I can be socially anxious today, and I can also be socially anxious like in 15 years, so it's not a yearly thing, it is just a group thing probably. But what would be interesting is whether also maybe the pandemic did did have their fair share in this whole thing, and many more situations that we have been in the past 10 years or something, or changes in society, changes in how things work, changes in changes in the world that might have led to that. So what I'm kind of aiming for is are generally people more prone to social anxiety nowadays, or in the last 5 years, no matter the age group? This would actually be kind of interesting.
Or even a panic attack when giving a presentation, for example, we likely try to avoid it in the future. We can avoid it by refraining from giving presentations altogether until we die. But when that isn't an option, we will have to face fear nevertheless. So how do we deal with this? First, we try to reason ourselves out of it. If we use common sense, we can intellectually comprehend that most social situations are not life-threatening. There's generally nothing to fear when giving a presentation, unless, perhaps, we're doing it in front of an audience, carrying guns that they'll use to shoot us when we fail. But despite our rational understanding, the prospect of these situations still evokes fear. It's a fear that we cannot seem to subdue with sheer effort or thought. Frankl called this anticipatory anxiety. When we experience anticipatory anxiety, we fear a specific outcome. In this case, it's not the situation itself, which is pretty harmless. It's the uncontrollable, absurd, and, first and foremost, unwanted fear that it evokes. After an employee who fears public speaking hears that she needs to give a presentation in front of her colleagues, she experiences anticipatory anxiety. Just like the sweating physician, she wants to prevent her anxiety from arising, as she dreads the idea of trembling and stammering nervously in front of her coworkers. But the more she fights the fear, the more it seems to persist. Herein lies the problem. As we become overly invested in stopping the anxiety, we fight fire with fire. We produce the exact thing we try to eliminate. As most people who've experienced this probably know, fighting fear doesn't work. Even worse, the symptoms, including trembling, dizziness, or a racing heart, only increase if we try. In his book, The Unheard Cry for Meaning, Psychotherapy and Humanism, Frankl explains that fighting the fear simply adds pressure to the already existing pressure. As we can see in this diagram, and as Frankl explains it, pressure induces counterpressure, and counterpressure in turn increases pressure. Again, we are confronted with a vicious circle. The question is, of course, how can we break this cycle?
And it kind of reminds me of the whole thing. Like, do not think about an ice bear or polar bear. And you probably think about a fucking polar bear. And with everything else. So, when I'm trying not to do something, then I'm probably doing it. Or at least I'm thinking about it. Of course, when I'm saying, okay, don't pee in your pants, it's probably also not going to happen, because I still have control over my body. But still, might just be about that, might just be even, the whole thing before was just reverse psychology, like don't think about it, so you are, which is just this, isn't it? Period.
Anticipatory anxiety results from hyperintention. Hyperintention is an excessive focus on achieving or preventing a particular outcome. An example of hyperintention at play is suffering from insomnia. The initial problem, the inability to fall asleep, is strengthened by a strong intention to fall asleep that follows. But the more the insomniac uses willpower to fall asleep, the worse his sleeping problems get and the more hyper-focused he becomes. Now, the inability to sleep has become this huge thing, and the sufferer may feel that it's destroying his life. To escape this cycle, Frankl proposed a paradox. Now, what's a paradox? A fitting Merriam-Webster definition of a paradox goes as follows: a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet is perhaps true. Of course, we want to get rid of anxiety in social situations, and we surely want to have a good night's sleep. It's common sense. But in this wanting also lies the problem. It makes us anxious and tense. So could the key to solving this problem be to, instead of wanting these things, paradoxically wanting the opposite? Paradoxical intention replaces the object of our desire with a statement that seems contradictory. Instead of wanting to get rid of fear, we decide that we want fear. Instead of wishing to fall asleep, we decide that we wish to stay awake as long as possible. So we completely turn the story around using a paradox, as we now wish for what we previously feared. Let's take a look at how this works, according to Frankl's experience with the sweating physician. A bit of anticipatory anxiety was enough for this young man to evoke excessive sweating. So Frankl advised him to deliberately show people how much he could sweat in situations that would arouse his fear. Every time he met someone that triggered his sweating, he would say to himself, "I only sweated out a quart before, now I'm going to pour at least 10 quarts. After a single session, he freed himself permanently from his phobia within a week. Paradoxical intention is essentially a way to trick oneself by replacing the object of our desire with a statement that seems contradictory to common sense. But for most people, it's probably challenging to engage in paradoxical behavior, as it seems an absurd thing to do.
And I also thought that it might just be about thinking about it. So just basically just being like, okay, I should sweat more, but not necessarily telling other people about it. And this might just do the trick, or this might just be the thing. Probably, maybe, I don't know, might be something that's also part of psychotherapy or psychology, just that, I don't know, when I'm telling somebody that it just increases like the likelihood that this is going to happen, or it increases like something, I don't fucking know. But yes, it's really interesting. I didn't expect that. I didn't really expect that to happen. Maybe also because it is, talking to other people, there, of course, it is not like giving a speech to an audience, but it is close. It has something to do with the others. So it might just also be about, deliberately taking action in this same space, but kind of the opposite way around, or in terms of the intention. So thinking about it might just not be enough.
Why would anyone wish to sweat excessively? Why would anyone want to be stuttering and shaking in front of people? Frankl clarifies that this method requires us to use our human capacity for self-detachment, inherent in a sense of humor. So we must be able not to take ourselves so seriously. To do this, we must detach and put ourselves at a distance from our neuroses and be willing to laugh at them. And we must be ready to make a fool out of ourselves as well, which is probably the most challenging part of it all. But if it works, why not give it a try? I quote, "As soon as the patient stops fighting his obsessions and instead tries to ridicule them by dealing with them in an ironical way, by applying paradoxical intention, the vicious circle is cut and the symptom diminishes and finally atrophies. In the fortunate case where there's no existential vacuum which invites and elicits the symptom, the patient will not only succeed in ridiculing his neurotic fear, but finally will succeed in completely ignoring it." End quote. So fight your fear and you'll be stuck with it.
Another story that I probably have heard many times before, and it might be Derek Sivers that told it. I don't know actually when. When was it? There is a podcast by actually by Tim Ferriss, but it is around his book Tools of Titans, which is kind of a compilation of different people and what they think of different things. So it is quite interesting. You can just skip a few things that you're just not interested in, and you can read more of what you're really interested in. And so the story goes the following way. He's riding his bicycle to a certain point. I think he moved to another place or to a new place, and he kind of, found riding his bicycle even more interesting than before, or actually really interesting and not at all before, something like that. I don't remember. But the point is, he knows the time that it takes him to go from A to B. And so at some point, he really is into this mindset of, okay, I want to get to B as fast as possible. Just because this is how he is, this is his personality. And the thing is, he's not that much slower. I think just a few minutes if he just goes from A to B and is not obsessing about the time and is not obsessing about how fast he is. And he's not really focusing on how fast he is. He's just riding his bike, willing to go from A to B. And I also often thought, well, what if I just don't focus so much on it? What if I'm just not obsessing so much about it? Is it going to be easier? Am I going to be better? Is the performance also going to be better? What if I just, I don't think if not caring more about it is kind of the key, if it makes sense, but just not obsessing, like not seeing it as something too overly important, which just, might be really difficult for certain things that are just important. But yeah, with that being said, I really really dearly hope that I've been able to share something of interest with you, and I hope we're going to see you the next time. So, bye-bye. And now I have to wait for a bit, so that there's also an outro in the podcast. Yes, in the stream, actually.